We're going to turn now to Noam Chomsky, who gave a major address yesterday at the University of the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. 2,000 people packed into the gymnasium to hear the professor of linguistics and one of the leading dissident voices in this country speak about the politics in the Middle East, the invasion of Iraq, and much more. This is Professor Noam Chomsky.
Well, let me start with last fall, last September, fall 2002. September was a very important moment in world affairs, in world history, in fact. Last September, the most powerful state in history declared its intention to maintain its domination of the world by force, the dimension in which it does reign supreme, and it made it clear that it would use this force not only to control the world, but to destroy any potential challenge that it sensed to trying to equal or oppose this force. There wasn't any mistaking the intended message. It was clear, frank, honest, and it was understood right in the heart of the establishment, in fact. So the main establishment journal, Foreign Affairs, in its next issue had an article by a well-known international relations specialist, John Eikenberry, who described it in words so clear and accurate that I'll just quote him instead of giving my own. He said that the United States had announced a grand strategy that begins with a fundamental commitment to maintaining a unipolar world in which the United States has no peer competitor, a condition that is to be permanent so that no state or coalition will ever challenge the United States as global leader, protector, and enforcer. The position renders international norms of self-defense enshrined by Article 51 of the UN Charter almost meaningless. In general, the stance dismisses international law and institutions as of little value. He says, if you read the document as you should, you'll notice that there's barely a mention of either the United Nations or international law. Going on with Eikenberry, the new imperial grand strategy presents the United States as a revisionist state seeking to parlay its momentary advantages into a world order in which it runs the show. It will prompt others to find ways to work around, undermine, contain, and retaliate against U.S. power. The strategy may appear successful in the short term, but, he goes on, it threatens to leave the world more dangerous and divided, and the United States less secure. It's a view which is, in fact, widely shared right within the foreign policy elite, not to speak of overseas, where George Bush has indeed succeeded in granting Osama bin Laden the wish beyond his wildest dreams, I imagine. He's turned the United States into the most feared and disliked and in many quarters hated country in the world. The rhetorical radicalism of this imperial grand strategy is highlighted when you contrast it with the conception of world order that's sustained by the International Court of Justice, the World Court. That was reiterated shortly before the strategy was announced by its president, who happens to be a U.S. judge, conservative U.S. Judge Schwabel. He's long been a lone defender of U.S. policies at the court. He was presenting the annual ICJ report to the United Nations. He informed the General Assembly that as the court enters the first century of the third millennium, it stands for international law, not international lawlessness, for the peaceful settlement of international disputes in conformity with international law, not the will of the more powerful party, for international organization, not for international anarchy, nor for a state sovereignty which purports to be above the law. It stands for human rights, rights that can be effectively realized only within functioning systems of law, local, national, and international. Exactly what is to be torn apart by the imperial grand strategy. Hard to find a more dramatic antithesis than this statement by a conservative U.S. justice and the administration of his country. And it sent plenty of shudders around the world, including, as I mentioned, U.S. foreign policy elites. If you read about it, it's often called a new doctrine of preemptive war. That's not really accurate. The term preemptive war actually has a meaning. Preemptive war means which could fall within the range of Article 51 of the UN Charter. That's the article which grants the unique right of use of force in self-defense against armed attack. Preemptive war would be a war against ongoing or imminent attack when no other means are available. So, for example, you may recall that 20 years ago, another cowboy leader over in the White House warned us that we were about to be attacked from an air base in the dangerous state of Grenada, where the Russians were going to use it to, assuming they could find it on a map, they were going to use the air base to bomb us. Okay, suppose that fantasy was real. It led to a U.S. invasion, after which the U.S. was standing tall once again for saving us from this threat. But suppose it were true, and the Russians were bombing us from Grenada, and the planes were in the air, and they were plainly heading to Washington to bomb the White House. Then it would be legitimate under the doctrine of preemptive war for the U.S. Air Force to shoot them down before they actually did the bombing, and maybe even to attack the air base in Grenada. That would be preemptive war. But that's not what's proposed. What's proposed is sometimes more accurately called preventive war. So in the technical literature, that's pointed out. Preventive, not preemptive. It means you're going to prevent any potential challenge. However, even that is much too generous. There's nothing to be prevented. So the invasion of Iraq wasn't intended to prevent anything. And the doctrine makes clear that what's going to be prevented is any challenge that the U.S. government decides is a potential challenge. Well, that's a doctrine of prevention which calls for Nuremberg trials. At the outset, the explanation was that preventive war would be against any country that's threatening to develop weapons of mass destruction, which could ultimately threaten us. After the fiasco about finding weapons of mass destruction, that was modified, and the latest version that's been pronounced by a high official is that the U.S. is entitled to carry out preventive war against any country that has the ability and intent to produce weapons of mass destruction. Well, just about anybody has the ability, including the local high school here, if it has a chemistry and biology lab. And intent is, you decide when there's an intent. So that essentially means we'll attack anybody we like. We decide they have the intent, they always have the ability, so it's fair game. The imperial grand strategy that was announced is a doctrine. When you announce a doctrine, you have to get people to take it seriously. It has to be converted into what respected, it's okay if I criticize lawyers, what respected legal commentators will call a new norm in international affairs. And in order to establish a new norm in international affairs, the doctrine has to be implemented. So therefore, Washington needed a test case to implement the new doctrine and establish it as a norm, what the New York Times, after the event, called a Petri dish test case, where you try it out and make people know that you mean it seriously. The target for preventive war has to meet a number of conditions. First crucial condition, and this is worth keeping in mind for predicting the future of the doctrine, the first crucial condition it has to meet is that the country has to be completely defenseless, kind of like Grenada. Otherwise it's not a good idea to get involved in a conflict. That requires a huge propaganda campaign, like in the case of Grenada, to build it up as an awesome threat, but then you miraculously succeed in overcoming it. But you have to understand that it's defenseless. The second crucial condition it has to meet is that the country has to be important enough to be worth conquering. So there's no point conquering some country in Africa that nobody ever heard of. The third point, the third condition, is that it has to be evil. So when you put together the three conditions, defenseless, important, evil, that spells Iraq. The first two conditions are obvious. It's obviously defenseless. It's enormously important, right in the heart of the world's energy-producing regions, second largest resources in the world. As to the evil, that's easy too. You just have to repeat the standard Bush and Blair and Powell rhetoric, which is all accurate except hypocritical. You have to repeat the mock horror about a man who's so evil that he would even use gas against his own people. Heard this hundreds of times, always omitting the crucial words, with our help, because we didn't care. You also have to express more mock horror about the, in fact, horrible mass graves that are being exposed every day from Saddam's vicious repression of the 1991 uprising that might well have overthrown him, again omitting the crucial words, with our help, for reasons that were in fact clearly explained right in the mainstream press. When the U.S. turned down requests from rebelling Iraqi generals to have access to captured Iraqi equipment and authorized Saddam Hussein to use the military helicopters and other heavy weapons that were, of which you can now see the effects. It was known then, but now it's graphically explained. It was explained in the press. We didn't like it, but it had to be done for higher reasons of state, to maintain what was called stability. The chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, essentially giving the State Department position, explained that we just had to do it. He said the best of all worlds for Washington would be an iron-fisted military junta ruling Iraq the same way that Saddam did, but with a different name, because his name was now embarrassing. We supported him all along, but can't do it anymore, so we need another Iraqi military junta, but somebody else. And since we haven't been able to find anyone else, we'll settle for Saddam Hussein, second best, but definitely not leave Iraq in the hands of its own people, which would have been the very likely outcome of the uprisings had the United States, which is of course in total control of the air and the ground at the time, if it hadn't essentially authorized the slaughters whose effects, grisly effects, are now being deplored. Well, that worked, and there is a guiding principle that remains. If you take a look at all the meandering of U.S. policy with regard to Iraq over the last years, there is one fixed principle. Iraq cannot be ruled by its own people.
Noam Chomsky addressing 2,000 people at the University of the District of Columbia on Sunday in Washington, D.C. We'll be back with that address in a minute. Ani DeFranco singing to the teeth here on Democracy Now!, the War and Peace Report, as we return to MIT linguist and leading dissident Noam Chomsky speaking in Washington, D.C.
2 days ago, leading Shiite cleric who was speaking to a huge crowd in the what's now been renamed the Sadr City slum in Baghdad, appealed to what he called people of humanity in the United States to oppose the U.S. military occupation and leave Iraq to its own people. And again, with all the meandering of policy, that principle has remained. Rejection of that option remains a constant, invariant principle. And it follows from the second of the three conditions, Iraq is just too important to be left to its own people. We've got to run it. Well, in any event, Iraq met all three conditions. The new norm of preventive war is therefore established. Legal scholars can now explain learnedly that law is a flexible living instrument with norms established by practice and so on. Again, there's a few words omitted. The norms are established by the practice of the most powerful state, nobody else. If others commit what was called at Nuremberg the supreme crime, namely the one that was just reenacted in Iraq, if others carry that out, or even lesser crimes, they don't establish new norms. In fact, they have to be severely punished. But when the most powerful state does it, that's a new norm, got a precedent, doctrine's fixed. Okay, back to September. One crucial event in September was the pronouncement of the new doctrine, and a second was the beginning of the massive propaganda effort to build up some degree of popular support for the planned implementation of the doctrine, the Petri dish. That's September's when the drumbeat of propaganda began about how Iraq was an imminent threat to U.S. national security. There were also insinuations about Iraq's responsibility for 9/11, about its links with al-Qaeda, its man's a terrorist, and so on. And that had a very quick effect. Within a few weeks, Congress passed a resolution granting the executive the right to use force at the White House's choice because of the threat to the national security of the United States. Those of you who, with a good memory, may recall that in 1985, the previous cowboy leader declared a state of national emergency in the United States because of the threat to the national security of the United States posed by the government of Nicaragua. That was after the threat from Grenada had been thankfully beaten back. But the Nicaraguans were only 2 days driving time from Harlingen, Texas. They're waving their copies of Mein Kampf, as the Secretary of State George Shultz put it, just about to destroy us, but as Reagan courageously announced, despite the odds, he's not going to be afraid. He's going to continue fighting, recalling Winston Churchill, which you're supposed to do in those circumstances. And we had a state of national emergency redeclared annually and redeclared again by Congress last October, this time with regard to Iraq, not Nicaragua. That had an instant effect. There was a huge government media propaganda campaign. By the end of September, polls registered that about 60% of the population thought that Iraq was an imminent threat to the security of the United States. Similar percentages quickly came to believe that Iraq was involved in, maybe even responsible for the September 11th attacks, and that it was linked to terror and planning new ones and so on. Those opinions were, as you'd expect, closely correlated with support for war. And that makes a lot of sense. You know, if you believe that Iraq is a major threat to, an imminent threat to our security, that it carried out the September 11th bombings, planning new ones, yeah, then it makes sense to prevent the next attack before it's too late. So correlation is not surprising. There was the carefully stage-managed speech, victory speech on the Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier, Bush announced a victory over terror because of Iraq's links to al-Qaeda. All of this is known to be complete fabrication, but it's quite effective. He could make that speech without fear that the headlines were going to say you're lying, and you know perfectly well there's no connection to al-Qaeda. One well-known commentator, senior associate of the Carnegie Foundation, Anatol Levin, describes this government media propaganda campaign. He says, for systematic mendacity, it has few parallels in peacetime democracies. And that's not entirely false, though. If you go back to the first tenure in office of the same people, it's mostly recycled Reaganites. There are plenty of similar examples, and unfortunately plenty in between, too. It was effective. The U.S. is unique in the world in having regarded Iraq as a threat to its security. Saddam Hussein was despised everywhere, quite rightly, but not feared. The countries of the region, which had every reason to fear him, didn't fear him. In fact, they'd been working for a number of years to try to reintegrate Iraq back into the regional system and maybe hope for some internal overthrow, which could have happened. Kuwait and Iran, two countries which Saddam Hussein invaded, they of course despise him, but they didn't fear him. And they didn't fear him for perfectly obvious reasons, perfectly well known to U.S. intelligence. Iraq was the weakest state in the region by a long shot. Its economy and its military expenditures were about a third those of Kuwait, which has 10% of its population, much less than other regional countries, far below the regional superpower, the U.S. offshore military base in Israel, which completely dominates the region militarily. But even next to the neighbors, it was essentially nothing. It's the first condition for the Petri dish. There was a relationship to al-Qaeda. The relation is that recruitment for al-Qaeda and similar networks shot up during the build-up to the war, and since then, exactly as had been predicted by intelligence agencies and independent strategic analysts, and for very obvious reasons. It's been understood that measures like this and threats like this will lead to proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and terror, if only partly for revenge, but if only for deterrence. That's well understood. Well, another event last September, critical event, was that September was the opening of the midterm election campaign. The most important person in Washington, Karl Rove, Republican campaign manager, had explained to Republican activists over the summer, in fact, that they had better make sure not to go into the election campaign allowing domestic issues to have any prominence, because they'll get smashed on that for obvious reasons. They have to switch the focus of the campaign to national security. That way, maybe people will hide under the umbrella of power and forget the fact that they don't have a pension and Kenneth Lay is walking away with their money and so on and so forth. And that was done. For the next presidential campaign coming up, Rove has already stated the obvious. It's nice that he says it. You can quote him. It's obvious even if he doesn't say it. Namely, that they're going to have to do the same thing for the presidential campaign for even more striking reasons. The Wall Street Journal correctly pointed out that the extravaganza on the Abraham Lincoln was the opening shot in the presidential campaign. It wasn't a victory speech. There's no victory, but it was the presentation of the powerful wartime leader who will protect us from the next dragon he'll be about to slay by then. The campaign, just by sheer accident, is beginning in New York City on September 11th. It's delayed to have the right date, and the core issue will be defending us from an imminent threat to existence. Crucially, don't pay any attention to that $44 trillion deficit that was calculated by government economists, but kept out of the federal budget message to Congress a couple of months ago so as to expedite passage of another tax cut for the rich. The purpose, as a number of mainstream top economists have pointed out, and is obvious again, is to yield what they call a fiscal train wreck, the purpose of which is to destroy social spending. So you can't go into an election saying we're going to wipe out any social spending that might help people, but you can say we've got a fiscal disaster, so therefore what can we do? You've got to destroy everything. In fact, it was conceded by White House spokesperson Ari Fleischer a couple of days ago in a press conference here. He was asked about the $44 trillion deficit, and he said, yeah, it's accurate. He said then here's what he said. He said, there is no question that Social Security and Medicare are going to present future generations with a crushing debt burden unless policymakers work seriously to reform those programs. Well, reform doesn't mean fund them with progressive taxation. What it means is dismantle them by various devious means. One is to transfer them over to the states, which have a crushing fiscal burden as well. And all of this is really important. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, schools, these all have very serious defects. They're based on a principle that is evil, as George Bush hears from his direct line to God. They're based on the principle. They're based on the principle of sympathy, the principle that Adam Smith and David Hume and other dangerous radicals described as the core of human nature. And that's correct. All of these institutions are based on the idea that you should care if the disabled widow across town can survive another day, or if the kid across the street can get a decent education. And that's evil. You're not supposed to believe that. Evil doctrines have to be driven from the mind, as Ashcroft and Bennett and other moral authorities can explain. And that means you got to eliminate the institutions. If you can only do it by a fiscal train wreck, do it that way. Actually, there are other advantages, many others, but one is that, say, privatization of Social Security, so say privatization of pensions, that has the great positive element of compelling working people to be actively committed day by day against their own interests. So if your pension depends on the profits of the company you're working for or whoever else you've invested in stocks, you must oppose decent wages, safety standards in the workplace, labor rights. You've got to oppose all those things because otherwise you won't have a pension. You have to make sure that the rich are happy, because if they're happy, maybe they'll be nice to you, just as in the feudal system, which they're effectively trying to restore. Sometimes a number of commentators have pointed out that the focus on national security and Iraq and all this business was done for short-term political advantage. But that understates the point. This is very serious. Maintaining a very thin hold on power is a very high priority. A couple more years in power, they may be able to institutionalize the extremely regressive programs that will seriously undermine human rights, civil liberties, create a kind of utopia of the masters. And the only way to maintain that thin hold on power is to inspire fear, exactly as Karl Rove explained. And worth bearing in mind that all of this is second nature to the people in office right now, mostly recycled from the Reagan-Bush administration, in fact from its most reactionary components. During the Reagan years, the policies that the government was carrying out were quite unpopular domestically, which isn't surprising. There was a period of it was a period of relatively slow growth, but also of stagnation or decline for much of the population. The U.S. ended up that period with the highest workload in the world and the lowest wages. That was a welcome development of transcendent importance, the Wall Street Journal editorial said, but the population didn't quite agree with that. In 1984, which is called a Reagan landslide, meant about 30% of the electorate, of the voters, by a considerable majority, about 3-2, hoped that his legislative program would not be enacted, and the unpopularity continued. At the end of the period, the Reagan-Bush period, in the regular poll of popularity of living ex-presidents, Reagan ranked right at the bottom, just beat out by Nixon, was a little more unpopular.
You're listening to Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, leading political dissident. We'll be back with his speech in Washington, D.C. in a minute. Shalom Salam by Alona Liarchik and Amal Merkis here on Democracy Now!, the War and Peace Report, as we return to Professor Noam Chomsky speaking Sunday at the University of District of Columbia in Washington, D.C.
There are a lot of consequences of the imperial grand strategy, and they're well known. One I've mentioned. It's almost certain to lead to proliferation of weapons of mass destruction as a deterrent. That was recognized at once. It increases with every additional step. So last week, Congress dropped the ban on research and development of low-yield nuclear weapons. Low yield means approximately a third of the Hiroshima bomb. That technology is too advanced for others to follow, except maybe for Israel, because it's an offshoot of U.S. power. But other countries aren't going to be able to follow that. However, it was immediately predicted, and plausibly, that that would be an incentive for other nuclear states to expand their own offensive capacities. For example, Pakistan or China, which means it'll spread to India. And there'll be a chain reaction, probably on to the major nuclear power in the Middle East, Asia region. A number of analysts have pointed out, and it's again obvious, that the Bush administration is practically pleading with Iran to initiate or accelerate a nuclear weapons program that's going to create a self-fulfilling prophecy in order to justify an invasion, or more likely, I think, subversion, because Iran fails the primary condition for a target. It's not defenseless. And that subversion may already be going on. Another consequence is to increase terror as a deterrent and a revenge. And it's a serious threat. No one should joke about it. Well, enhancing serious threats to U.S. security is, in fact, quite rational within the accepted framework of assumptions. Maybe the framework is lunatic, but the choices within it are quite rational. There just are higher priorities. So establishing the imperial grand strategy of world domination and restructuring domestic society under the control of unaccountable systems of private power, reducing democracy to empty forms. These are really high priorities. And to achieve them, it's worth facing the threat of massive terror and possible nuclear war. It's not the first time in history that such choices have been made by dedicated leaders. Kind of a miracle we've survived this long, but you can understand the rationality of the policies given the framework. There are other problems. One critical one is the Middle East, the Israel-Palestine problem. Continuing turmoil there threatens U.S. control of the world's major energy resources, and something has to be done about that. Well, what's supposed to be done, we read about. We're supposed to stare in awe at the president's vision of a Palestinian state. You've noticed, I'm sure, that there's a journalistic convention by now that whenever you mention George Bush, you have to mention his vision of something or other. The vision is never described. We don't know what it is, but it's noble by definition. In this case, his vision of a Palestinian state, somewhere, some authority, nobody knows. That's a wonderful vision. You have to forget a few facts when you describe his vision of a Palestinian state. Namely, there's been an international consensus for almost 30 years on establishing a Palestinian state in the territories occupied by Israel. It's also supported by two-thirds of the American public now, meaning a two-state settlement on the international border pre-June '67 with some mutual adjustments, a one-to-one land swap or something like that. For almost 30 years, that's been blocked unilaterally by the United States. I won't run through it, but it continues right through the Clinton-Barak years. So during the Clinton-Barak years, the 1990s, there was a huge program of building settlements and infrastructure with the clear design of splitting the West Bank into 4 cantons, north, central, south, all separated from East Jerusalem, a little bit of East Jerusalem, the center of Palestinian cultural and commercial life, which is to be virtually separated. And technically, there's some passages, but very hard to maneuver, kind of a 4 Bantustan settlement. And that's continuing. The Camp David proposals, year 2000, the Clinton-Barak proposals, they were lauded profusely in the press, magnanimous, wonderful, and so on. There's a very easy way to evaluate the praise, namely, have a look at the map that was proposed. Well, that's a little difficult. Apparently, not a single map was published anywhere in the U.S. press, at least nobody can find one. It's not that the maps were unavailable. They were published in Israel, they were published in Europe, they were published in the standard scholarly sources and the dissident literature, but no map was available for people to determine the magnanimity of the offer, and there's a plausible reason for that. As soon as you looked at the map, you saw exactly what I described. 4 cantons mix. South Africa's Bantustan programs 40 years ago looked pretty good. And Sharon and Bush in the next phase are just extending that. While the vision is being pronounced, the bulldozers are happily at work as well. And they're creating the facts on the ground, which will tell you what the vision is. There's a separation wall being built from the north. It's already surrounded and virtually destroyed the Palestinian town of Qalqilia. It was announced a couple of weeks ago that south of that it's going to extend to the east, including Ariel and Emmanuel, 2 settlements to the east. That establishes within the separation wall, meaning on the Israeli side, one of the 2 Clinton-Barak salients, which were to split the West Bank in 3, establishes the northern of the 2 salients. Nobody doubts that the bigger and more important salient from Jerusalem way over to the east, almost to Jericho, will also be included. That includes the town of Ma'ale Adumim, which was built primarily under Clinton and Barak in order to bisect the partition of the West Bank. The territories that are assigned to the settlements go far beyond the actual settled parts, allowing for expansion without any change in the settlement boundaries. Estimates by Israeli analysts are that includes approximately 50% of the West Bank. And Sharon understands it perfectly well. A lot of talk about how he made this diplomatic move of accepting the roadmap, but less talk about what he told his cabinet. He told them, don't worry about it, about settlement. He said, there is no restriction here, and you can build for your children and grandchildren, and I hope for your great-grandchildren as well. And that's very reasonable, given the way the facts on the ground are being established. Quite apart from the vision and the facts on the ground, there's also a record of actions which you can look at. So the Bush administration's first major act with regard to Israel-Palestine at the United Nations in 2001, December, was to veto the dispatch of international monitors in an effort to reduce the level of violence in the territories. They want the violence to continue because they know it's mostly Israeli violence to suppress the Palestinians. Just a week before that, the Bush administration boycotted and therefore undermined a meeting of the high contracting parties of the Geneva Convention. That's just about everybody, including the whole European Union, which once again produced a harsh condemnation of illegal actions, including just about everything that's going on there, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. All of this, incidentally, is silenced. You don't read anything about it. Last December, at the next meeting of the UN, the U.S. took a position which, if it's taken seriously, is extremely significant. Every year, the United Nations has ratified a 1968 Security Council resolution calling on Israel to terminate it and withdraw from its effective annexation of Jerusalem, expansion and annexation of Jerusalem. This year, last December, for the first time, the United States voted against that. To be precise, it voted against a resolution reaffirming it, meaning voted essentially in favor of the annexation. If that's meant seriously, that's extremely significant. It ends any possibility of any settlement. Jerusalem is now a big area extending into the West Bank. There are two major areas of the world which could go their own way. These are long-standing. One of them, Europe, is a long-standing problem. 30 years ago was what was called the Year of Europe. And Henry Kissinger then made a famous address called the Year of Europe Address, in which he instructed the Europeans that they have what he called regional responsibilities, which they are to carry out within the overall framework of order managed by the United States. But don't forget your limits. A lot of the manufactured hatred about France and Germany has to do with they are the heartland of the European economy and of its political strength, and therefore the threat that they might move towards some kind of independent course remains very significant. By now there are similar problems in Asia. Northeast Asia is the most dynamic economic region in the world, the fastest growing. Its gross domestic product is considerably larger than the United States. It has a half of the financial reserves of the world. It's an integrated region. It has resources, developing industrial countries, leading ones that need the resources, integrated pipelines going from, say, Siberia to South Korea. Quote a recent U.S. study, pipelines could enhance regional stability and provide cheap alternatives to oil imported from the Middle East, where the United States maintains control. That's quite significant. One of the major reasons to control the Middle East oil reserves has been to maintain what George Kennan 50 years ago called veto power over other countries. If they forget that they have only regional responsibilities, we can strangle them. But if the integrated region of Northeast Asia actually moves towards independence, as it could, that veto power could be lost. The North Korean issue is very much entangled in this. Well, without going on, there are plenty of ominous developments in world affairs. The United States, of course, plays a leading role. It is far and away the most important military power and a huge economy. And for us, that's a very lucky thing. In much of the world, people can't really do very much. In large parts of the world, they live under such repression that they can mostly watch and fear. But we are uniquely privileged, and we can determine the course of future events very substantially. It's not necessary to say that the stakes are very high. It's no exaggeration to say that by this point they literally reached to survival of the species.
Professor Noam Chomsky speaking at the University of District of Columbia Gymnasium yesterday in Washington, D.C. And that does it for today's program. If you'd like to get a video or audio of today's show, you can call 1-800-881-2359. That's 1-800-881-2359. To listen to other interviews and speeches of Noam Chomsky, you can go to our website at www.democracynow.org. That's democracynow.org, and our email address is mail@democracynow.org.